First, I'd like to ask you some questions about Watergate. How did the public react to the scandal?
Well, in the beginning, most people didn't think it was that serious. It really was something that wasn't that big a deal of front page stories, but as more and more information came out, I think the critical thing was not so much that it was a break in because people thought it was just like individual low level people, but as it went higher up and up the chain, and people realized that not only was the White House involved, but ultimately President Richard Nixon himself actually knew about Watergate, even if it was after the fact, and he was involved in covering up and was dishonest and wasn't truthful and really, kind of obstructed justice, didn't really want those people to be caught. You realize that the president really had committed criminal acts. That made it very serious.
So, do you feel like you had more distrust towards government officials after that?
Yes, I think people used to think, one day your kid could go up to be president, and then you realize after that your kid could go up to be president, and the president could be a crook. So that made people much more leery about people, especially Richard Nixon. You say, "Let me make something perfectly clear," and you realize that perfectly clear didn't have to be truthful.
So, was the topic something that was heavily discussed in like workplaces or at the dinner table?
Absolutely. After it got more and more involved, and people were speculating what should happen. Should the president be impeached? Should he resign? Where is this going to end up? Will the president refuse to turn over the tapes? Would the president basically go against the Constitution and say he wasn't going to listen to the courts? I mean, those were very serious issues.
So how did Nixon try to cover his tracks?
He denied. He fired people who were involved, and he really tried to act as if he knew nothing about it when he really was fully involved.
Okay, thank you. So, what was significant about Jimmy Carter's election?
He was the first Southerner since the Civil War to be elected, and not only that, he was from the Deep South. He was from Georgia, so he was a Democrat from the Deep South, and that was significant. It was the first time that happened since the Civil War.
Why do you think that he was elected?
Well, there were a couple things. I mean, Gerald Ford had taken over after Nixon resigned, and a lot of people felt that, in pardoning Nixon, I think that made him a little bit suspect. And Jimmy Carter made a big thing about being an outsider. He was a governor. He wasn't, in Washington. He never served in Washington as like a senator or a congressman. So he gave himself as the image of like the honest outsider who wasn't from Washington.
What do you think that his most significant accomplishment while in office was?
I think the Camp David Accords, getting a peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation, and Egypt was certainly like the major Arab nation, brokering that peace, and really the peace has lasted all those years between Israel and Egypt. I do think that's a lasting achievement.
What is your opinion on the end of the Vietnam War?
The U.S. lost the war. We had gone in there to stop the North Vietnamese, and they wound up taking over all of South Vietnam, and there was no more South Vietnam. It just became one overall communist Vietnam.
So what's your lasting impression or opinion on the end of the war?
Well, my final memory was really a terrible one. I mean, the U.S. Embassy was circled essentially by the North Vietnamese, and the people were climbing up to the roof, and the helicopters were taking off from the roof, which as many people as they could fit in the helicopters to bring them to the ships, to bring them to America. And literally, people were like hanging out of the helicopters. It was a very, very big disgrace that the U.S. had to like evacuate at the last minute whoever they could kind of bring out in those last final days and hours.
So were you relieved when the war was over?
I think we all were glad. It had dragged on for so many years, and I think about 50,000 Americans were killed and maimed and whatnot. It was not a good war for us, and it ended badly.
And did you personally know people who had fought during the war?
Not really, because I was still relatively young. So I was still maybe like in junior high school when the war ended. So I didn't know anyone personally. I don't believe, but certainly many kids when they came out of high school went over to Vietnam, and it was a very scary thing.
What distinct memories do you have about the Cold War coming to an end?
I think the biggest thing was when the Berlin Wall, which had separated East and West Berlin and been there for, I don't know, about 40 years, when it literally was knocked down by the people, where the people essentially revolted and East met West, and people weren't stuck in communism anymore.
So who do you think should be held responsible for ending the war?
I think the two major players were Gorbachev and Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And Gorbachev, by trying to make Soviet Union, Russia a little more modernized, a little more of a free market economy, and Reagan by being very strong over here, I think the Russians realized, the Soviets realized that they really couldn't compete that old way, and they had to change with the world, and they did.
So once it was over, do you think things were different?
Yeah, all those European countries, they kind of opened up,
Mm-hmm.
and they became much more free and capitalistic. And I've even been to some of those countries now. I never would have
Mm-hmm.
gone there under communism.
Yeah.
You know, people go and people even study in those countries. It's a very different world now.
When was the first time you really got to see and use computers?
I think it was in 1984. I had a summer job, and I remember I didn't even really know how to use it. And at one point I thought I broke it, so I just turned it off. And I came back into work the next day, and I turned it on and I worked. I was very happy.
So what was your first reaction when you saw the computer?
Well, seeing it really wasn't much of anything. It was more using it. I mean, it just was a thing that kind of sat there. It was more using it that really, I guess, we saw some of the power.
And so at what point do you think computers really began to like have a profound change on society?
It was the early '80s. You started to have computers in the workplace. People actually had PCs, personal computers. Before that, people had typewriters. There was really none computing going on.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you think, obviously today's computers are very different, but what would be like a major difference between them from the 80s to today?
Well, they're much more powerful. I think we had like 80K. I mean, the memory was so limited. There's so limited things that you can do. Spreadsheets were much more basic. We really didn't have windows. Everything had to be just in kind of one setting, and now you can have multiple windows open. But the idea is not so different. It got more advanced.
How would you grade Ronald Reagan on a scale from 1 to 10?
I'd say about a 7 or 8. He was a strong leader. He was very good in foreign policy. He was a big impact in ending the Cold War. And he did do some major economic initiatives here, too.
And how would you compare him to other presidents? Like in total, what would you rank him as?
I'm not sure if he's certainly in the top half. I don't know about the top quarter, but certainly in the top half.
And so the public generally liked him?
Yeah, he was elected. His second election was in a landslide.
Mm-hmm.
Again, people saw him as a strong, positive leader.
And what did you remember most about him?
I think maybe him even getting shot. He was shot just a few months when he was in office, and he recovered very quickly. But that kind of set the tone. People felt very sympathetic to him after something like that happened.
So where were you when the World Trade Center was bombed?
I was at work in Midtown Manhattan, and we didn't have cell phones or email or stuff like that back then. So I remember they put a memo out, and they circulated the memo to everyone, telling people, stay calm and not be worried, and the police are looking into it. And that was just the initial bombing. I mean, it wasn't 9/11, so it wasn't as destructive, but still a number of people died, and it was the first terrorist incident in New York in a long time.
So how do you think things changed after that?
Not as much as certainly it did 9/11, because, again, the World Trade Center wasn't destroyed, and people sort of, it kind of drifted out of memory fairly quickly.
And how do you think that influenced the way that we look towards other nations and interacted with nations?
Well, I don't think we ever discovered a foreign country. I mean, the people who were involved were foreigners, and I think ultimately kind of involved with the Al Qaeda type things. But it was never linked to a foreign country, so I don't think we blamed another country for it.
What was your impression of the O.J. Simpson trial?
It was the first trial I can remember that was televised, and that had a big impact because people could actually follow it. You'd see snippets on the news, but it seemed like it was a fair trial. And I remember even the jury proceedings and all. It seemed like it was
Mm-hmm.
fair.
And so, how did the country react?
Unfortunately, it was along racial lines. Many people who were Caucasian felt that he was guilty. Many people who were black felt that he wasn't, and celebrated when he was found not guilty. And I think we realized that the country was divided along racial lines,
And
especially in this
did
incident.
you think he was guilty?
Yeah, I think there was quite a bit of evidence. I understand that maybe they couldn't have convicted him because
Mm-hmm.
it had to be beyond a reasonable doubt, but I did think he was.
So you must have watched most of it. Did you follow it pretty carefully?
Well, I didn't watch it all. I mean, it got very boring. We'd be on during the day. I'd be working, but you'd certainly hear about it and see it on the news and in the newspapers and all. It was a front page story for pretty much the whole time.
Did you feel connected to the first Iraqi war, or was it more of a distant matter to you?
Well, I remember thinking if I ever was going to be drafted, this would be the time because if the war dragged on, I was still kind of an age where maybe I possibly could be. But the war actually was very quick. It was over
Mm-hmm.
very fast.
And do you think it influenced future conflicts?
Somewhat. The U.S. assembled a whole broad coalition and got
Mm-hmm.
many other countries involved to help with the fighting, and that's something we tried to do later on with the next Iraqi war.
So, what, if any, are the long lasting effects that you would maybe see today?
I don't know if there were any long-lasting effects because we had to go in the second time.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was the first time, and this was the second time. I guess the major effect was maybe by leaving Saddam Hussein in power, we ultimately had to go in less than 10 years later and get involved in another war.